the computer books. You can't learn computers if you're not literate. So a higher level of literacy and education, right? But within that, that's always centered globally in English. So what she's saying here, society is changing. So we had only, still in the 60s, there is that village in Austria, that's a peasant village. The women go out and they say, we're moving to the bra factory to be a factory worker. Now, 30 years go by, lots of people are factory workers or similar, male and female, and what happens next? The economy is changing again to a more global economy where you need new skills again. And among those new skills are English, are bilingualism, and even in Canada, a very advanced country, so we're not talking about a post-colonial country, it's been a long time that became post-colonial. We're talking about one of the richest countries in the world. And yet the same situation is occurring here, that it is the women who are using a language, a foreign language skill to move out. This unit, I don't have time to go into that. There's an article about in China, how the same thing is happening. The women in China are learning English to make that move. Japan and a bunch of other countries. So it becomes, language becomes a tool, a commodified tool, symbolic capital, real capital, much more for women as a form of real or imagined mobility, or at least some kind of economic mobility. Okay, now let's look at the most complicated case, Arabic, and specifically around the article that you had to read. Okay, so as a prologue to that, let me just make a couple statements from two other articles you don't have to read, but they're both about Arabic. The first one is by Walters, who starts with a quote about Sharia law and how women were voiceless in the Sharia law courts, like if they wanted a divorce or anything else. And they describe how voiceless women could make their voicelessness nevertheless heard in the court. So, in Tunisia, a woman can in no way ask for a divorce according to Islamic law. So this woman wants a divorce, so what does she do? On the rare occasions when Sharia, or Islamic law, consented for a woman to have a divorce and for her to request a divorce rather than the man to initiate it, was when her husband had sodomized her. Okay? So what is she going to do? How is she going to go to the court and say, my husband has sodomized me and I want a divorce? Where you can't say, she can't say anything, but even if she could, she couldn't say that because that's not sayable publicly. So she had to go to ask for justice from a judge in the Islamic court. When she arrived before the judge, she squatted and arranged her shoes upside down, thereby indicating that her husband had entered her from behind. So by the symbolism of the shoes, I mentioned to you another day that in Spanish to this day, Peninsular Spanish, calzar a una mujer, to put on shoes, but to use the word woman instead of shoes is to have sexual intercourse with a woman. The shoe being the woman and the, well, you get the rest. Okay, so that's how to have some sort of voice in voicelessness. The other article talks about diversity and uniformity in Morocco. It talks about the bilingualism, diglossia, Arabization, and all of those things that are in Moroccan society that Sadiki also tells us, but this will tell us a few more details I'll come back to. So let's think about the article you were supposed to read. What are the languages? The location is Morocco, so that we know. What are the languages? Standard Arabic, Moroccan Arabic, French, and Berber. Standard Arabic is very misleading. I prefer to call it classical Arabic. They call it both in different articles. Standard Arabic implies that there's a standard spoken language in the country, which there isn't. Okay, so classical Arabic is like in the Middle Ages. And just think, what is there in the Middle Ages in Europe was the same thing. When in the 13th century, late 12th and 13th century, universities started being open in Europe. First in Italy, then Oxford and Paris, Oxford, Cambridge. Well, first of all, naturally, only guys could go there, okay? And what did they learn at the universities? How did they learn? Latin. You could go to Oxford and then you could go to Padua. You could change universities because you had gone to school as a boy learning Latin because that was the only written language. It doesn't matter if your dialect was some sort of dialect of German or some sort of a dialect of what we call Italian today or Spanish. That was your dialect, like the Polish was for those Jews. And you had to learn Latin, and you learned that throughout school. And when you went to university, you could go to university of any of those places because there was that classical language. So what Sadiki sometimes calls standard Arabic, and sometimes, fortunately, she doesn't, is really classical Arabic. That is, has the same role as Latin does, but it's also, and it's both a religious language, as Latin was, and it is the high language and the classical language and the language of the Quran, so it's the prestige language. Now, let's look at how is each one gendered. Classical language, Arabic is obviously gendered male. Why?
Because it's the prestige.
But, okay, it's the prestige, but it's more than that. Yeah?
It's the language of religion. So
And girls can't go to,
they can't go to mosques because women aren't supposed to go to that.
but not only can't go to mosque, they can't go to schools, the madrasa where
Yeah.
they teach classical Arabic. So it's much like those Jewish women where the Orthodox Jewish women are in the same role, that they don't have a role in that, just knowing some prayers. So the classical Arabic is absolutely gendered male, both for its historical importance and prestige and religiosity, but also in practical terms because they don't teach it to women. Yes?
And like there was also a note about how like educated feminists who use Arabic like give them an authority and like a powerful domain and kind of like dilutes the like male politician.
But it's very rare.
Yeah.
It's like a really new thing. It's the kind of the equivalent of, in the Jewish religion now, having female rabbis, you know, which absolutely wasn't allowed, and there's only a handful of them even today. In Hungary, there's one, and she was educated in England, and in the Orthodox, they don't accept that at all. So that women's voice being heard, what you're saying is they're using that classical language to say, I have a place, pushing open the door.
Yeah.
But it's a very small opening. Okay, so you have classical Arabic. Then, the spoken Arabic. What about the spoken Arabic? Who uses that? Everybody, essentially, almost everybody. And so that's the one that's the least gendered, because that's the one that is either the first language of many people, or they know some of it to communicate, because in fact, the native language of 50% of the rural population, and maybe 40% of even the urban population, depending what urban group, is not Arabic at all, but Berber. And that's the big secret, because we think of it as all Arabic, but the area has been Arabized. That is, Berber is the indigenous language. That area was Berber, which is not an Arabic language at all. It's not related or anything. And what is today the role of Berber? How is it gendered? Yes?
It's like similar to Yiddish in that it's associated with like intimacy and domesticity, so it's like very like feminine coded.
It's totally feminine coded, but in addition to Yiddish, I mean, like Yiddish, but even more so, because there's another aspect too.
The nannies speak.
Well, so therefore, there's the ruralness, where the Yiddish, everybody spoke it at home, until they went to the city and got so assimilated that they got cityfied and they gave it up. But in a given community, in a smaller town, everybody spoke it. So Berber is very rural, and it's doubly rural, not only because that's where it's conserved, but the men leave the rural areas to go to work in the city. So the villages are full of children and old people. And so the women are there in control, but yet it has a kind of prestige of a sort, which is that intimacy we kept on talking about. And even if you're not a Berber speaker, let's say you're a rich city girl and your parents spoken Arabic at home, and I mentioned my friend in Tunisia who was in that category. As far as I know, her parents never spoke Berber at home, and maybe didn't. But people like that have a nanny who's Berber, so they at the very least learn songs and other things like that. and they may speak Berber. So that becomes the language, the female language. And then how about French? It's, well, of a certain education, everybody has to learn it, because you can't go to college, but yes?
It's basically how English functions in Saudi Arabia.
It's exactly the way English functions in Saudi Arabia now, except it has one more complication.
It's also the colonial language.
Yes, post-colonial language, where English is really just the Western language, and so you can be a cosmopolitan woman without having any emotional thing, whereas if I get here, this is a famous Moroccan writer who actually became a member of that famous French Academy, one of the first women they let enter, has a big problem because she writes in Arabic, I mean she writes in French, because that's the literary language that she learned and that's where she gets readership, but yet she looks at French as the language of blood and of colonialism, and so she has these mixed feelings, and if we have a chance I'll read you some quotes of that. For the Saudis, they don't have that with English. English is just a foreign language that has this utility and power and prestige and fantasy, whereas here, French is an exogenous language, that is, it's neither Arabic nor Berber, it's not from the land, it's imported from the outside. It's a post-colonial language that you said, as I didn't write down here, and they call it langue étrangère privilégiée, that is, the privileged foreign language that we use here, as a way of getting around saying it's the colonial language, which makes it sound negative and we don't want it. But by saying it's that language we give because we have this connection with, and those women who in Morocco or Tunisia are the equivalent of those cosmopolitan women we define in Saudi Arabia, never know any classical Arabic at all. That is quite amazing. Now, what did these women do in addition that is very important, these cosmopolitan women? Not only do they speak French, and what does it mean that they went to school? Because the girls who came from religious backgrounds, when their brothers went to the religious schools, to the madrasa, what happened to the girls after the 4th and 5th grade? They didn't go to school anymore. So that's when they totally separated, and in fact, she says the same thing, that when she was in about the 4th grade, her father was under colonialism still. He was an employee, a bureaucrat. So he wanted his daughter to be educated. And she said, so when I was a child, I was immersed in this spoken Arabic, no classical Arabic. Then when I was in the 4th grade, I was torn away from my friends who went on to stay at home and get married young, and I was pulled into a French school where I was studying mostly with the Pieds Noirs, who were the white colonials children who were there at that time. So she entered a totally different world and different peers because of studying in French. Okay, so yes, so these women then, these privileged women, the cosmopolitan women, what else do they do that's very important? So they actually all speak spoken Arabic. They probably know Berber to some degree. They often now also know English. But what do they do with their French? We talked about it a little bit last time, that code switching. Yes?
Never mind. Because they like switch between the different languages with like,
But which ones?
French and Moroccan.
Yeah, French and Moroccan Arabic, and they're constantly switching. Often I would hear them doing 50-50 intrasententially even. So not just one sentence, but putting in intrasententially, switching within the sentence. And what was that used for? It was used most often for solidarity with their peers, their other female friends, that we're the same. It's no different than what we talked about before, like in that group of that code study of women talking in single-sex groups, and one says, oh, I went to this funeral, it was terrible, and then you say, oh yeah, I know just what you mean, when my grandfather died and I went to the funeral, it was terrible. That creation of intimacy, so that code switching. Of course, you don't have to be Moroccan women and Arabic. I used to live at one time in my life, in my checkered life, I lived in Geneva, and my best friend was Hungarian. And she also knew English because she had lived in England